Hi, everyone. Welcome to a conversation hosted by SASH, the Society for the Advancement of Sexual Health. And this is one in a series of conversations that we've been doing to engage spiritual leaders. Because at SASH, there's a focus on addressing sexual and relational issues and addressing the whole spectrum of things from sexual health to problematic sexual behavior. And one thing that we know is that people turn to helping professionals when they are in a time of need. And sexual and relational issues hit people's lives. And when they don't know where to turn, a lot of times they turn to a trusted professional. And faith leaders are people that are trusted. Oftentimes they're free resources in communities. And so individuals, couples, families turn to faith leaders for help with their some of these private issues. And so we are here as a community of professionals wanting to acknowledge that and wanting to address some of the things that we know come up. One of the uniquenesses is that faith leaders oftentimes are not trained in some of these topics the way that professionals outside the faith community are. And so that's one of our is to invite faith leaders into communities like SASH, where there is a level of training and academia and professionalism and specialization. Honestly, that is such a resource. And so we invite you into this community, we invite you into this conversation. And we've been talking about the lived experience of women with the patriarchy. And today we are going to continue in that conversation. My name is Gina, and I've been a member of SASH for the last 5 years. I am a former pastor's wife. Me and my husband were in ministry for almost 20 years. And I know what it's like to be on the inside as a faith leader. I also know what it's like to be someone who is struggling with issues of sexual relational issues as a leader, looking for help in faith communities. I also know what it's like to go outside the faith communities and to find specialized help. So I come at this with a lot of lived experience and a lot of passion for this particular topic. I am a health educator. I'm a behavioral health specialist. I live and work in Austin, Texas, and I've done a lot of different things in my career, but mostly I'm here to just elevate conversation. And so I'll be facilitating this conversation today along with my colleague, Brian Vaughn, and I'm going to pass it to him to introduce himself.
Good afternoon. Glad that all of you could join us again, and those of you who are live and those of you who will be watching this at some point. My name is Brian Vaughn. I am a licensed professional counselor, a certified sex addiction therapist, a certified sex offender treatment provider. I am at a practice in Fredericksburg, Virginia, called Riverside Counseling. I've been here for almost 4 years. At one time, I was a Roman Catholic priest for the Archdiocese of Washington in the 80s and 90s. And at this point, I just continue to be a fellow seeker and a male being called to speak out more against violence against women, particularly as we are reflecting on much violence in our country right now. So I've had the pleasure of joining Gina for the last 2 webinars, and prior to that, I facilitated 2 others in which, again, we discussed how we can best help faith leaders. So again, I'm really grateful to be here and glad that all of us can join together.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. Well, let's introduce the other panelists, and please tell us, why you have been interested in being part of this conversation. Tell us who you are, and we'll start with Zach Lambert.
Yes, my name is Zach Lambert. I'm the pastor of a church called Restore Austin in urban Austin, Texas. We launched about 6.5 years ago, and I think I've been really interested in this conversation. First and foremost, just as a learner, last time was so beneficial to just kind of sit and listen to the perspectives of women in the patriarchy, because that's not my unique perspective. But I do engage in what can be a traditionally patriarchal kind of world of Western Christianity. And I think I see it as my role to do what I can to dismantle the patriarchy that exists inside of Western Church, and to return to what I kind of see as a flat hierarchy or no hierarchy at all between men and women inside of church world. So that take is really informed by how Jesus interacted with women in scripture. And that's kind of why I'm interested in this and hopeful about this. So first as a learner, and then second as a dismantler of the patriarchy practitioner.
Love it. Thank you for being here, Zach. Tom.
Yeah, I'm Tom Ryan. I go by TC Ryan. That's my author name. I was for a long time a pastor of an evangelical church in the Kansas City metropolitan area. And my wife and I had planted that church, and I pastored for 19 years. But during those years, I also was trying to cope and struggling to cope with compulsive sexual behavior disorder. So I'm in recovery. I'm in recovery from being a pastor. I'm in recovery from being a sex addict. Over the last few years, I've enjoyed participating in a couple of certification programs through the International Institute of Trauma Addiction Professionals, and most recently the PSAT program, Pastoral Sex Addiction Professional. I wrote a book in 2012 called The Shame No More, A Pastor's Journey Through Sex Addiction. And it's one of the secrets that really is crippling the spiritual vitality of the church, is that we don't know how to talk about sexuality. We don't know how to help those who are struggling with sexuality. And among all of our crimes, I don't know of anything that robs us of more vitality than the treatment of women in almost every way, and the misogyny that just works around the church in hidden ways. And so I have a real heart for what SASH is doing in these recordings and conversations. And in my work now as the executive director of Living Integrated, we seek to help individuals who are struggling with compulsive sexual behavior utilize healthy recovery practices and integrate those with healthy spiritual practices. But we also try to help institutions, and that would include churches and congregations that want to learn how to talk about sex positively, not be afraid of it. Everybody's got a story. There's so much that hurts us there, and the more we hide it, the more it robs us of the kind of vitality that congregations need to have and are capable of having. So I'm so humbled to be here. Thanks, Gina.
We're so glad you're here. Thank you, Tom. Julie Ann.
Hi, I'm Julie Ann Smith. I was an active blogger at Spiritual Sounding Board. My story is quite interesting. I left a negative Google review about my church because it was spiritually harmful, and I got sued by my pastor. And I started a blog just to tell my story. I won the lawsuit, which was great. But in doing so, my blog went viral, and people were coming to me, telling me their spiritual abuse stories. One of the things that I covered on my blog was clergy sexual misconduct. The Ravi Zacharias story was broken on my blog, and there were other cases, Tully and Shavijan, and so women reached out to me who had experienced clergy sexual misconduct. Also, I had a lot of women who were suffering from abusive marriages. And as I was telling their stories, it resonated with me in my personal life. And so now I am a divorced woman with 7 children. And as I've gone public with my story, a lot of women have reached out to me, and thankfully, I'm connected with a network of other women and resources so that I can help women get help that they need and start a new path if they so desire. So that's a bit of my background. I happened on this journey by accident, but I've learned a lot along the way, and I've been doing this over about 10 years or so.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Julianne.
Thank you.
Mike.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Cipressi. I'm a licensed clinical social worker just outside Philadelphia. I've been a social worker in the world of work for like over 35 years. I'm a certified employee assistance professional. Also got a CSAT about 10 or 12 years ago. And for probably about the last 12, 15 years ago, I've worked as an independent contractor, work at the Growth and Recovery Center, working with people with sexual compulsivity problems. And in terms of my clergy, I'm only 3 years a deacon in the Roman Catholic Church. So most of my experience has been as a social worker and kind of new to the clergy. So I'm very happy to be here. I was a little hesitant, quite frankly, to join because I listened to the other conversation and I really feel I wasn't qualified, in terms of just my own personal experience. But I do kind of pride myself on listening to people and learning from others. I am such a student of my clients. I often say that to them. I'm a student to you as well as a therapist to you. And I'm looking forward to this dialogue and the discussion and learning more about this patriarchy. Thanks.
Thanks for accepting the invitation, Mike. All right, Jackie.
Hi, I'm Jackie Pack. I am located in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I am also, like Mike, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm also a certified sex addiction therapist, and I own a group practice where we specialize and focus on compulsive sexual behavior, betrayal, trauma, as well as just working with, problematic sexual behavior. Maybe that's infidelity and it hasn't evolved or is not going to evolve into addiction, but is still causing problems for individuals and within their marriage. So we work kind of with a variety of sexual issues and the impact of problematic sexual behavior on a spectrum. I think, the reason initially that I was wanting to be part of the conversation, I think I mentioned that in the first the first recording, right? And so I won't get into that again. But since then, I've been thinking, just as I sit in sessions or in groups or, talk to people who are reaching out for services for betrayal trauma, I think just kind of thinking about this patriarchal structure and a patriarchal lens, I think in many ways, patriarchy betrays all women. And I think it also betrays a lot of males. And so, I wonder how much different things would be if we had a different structure, or if we had opted, our ancestors from eons ago, if they had opted for a different power structure and a different, decision-making structure, how different things might be. And so I think these conversations are valuable. I think it's important to have a lot of different perspectives coming to the table. Sometimes I wonder if we are equipped to, bring about the changes that are necessary. But I think, having voices from different perspectives gives us an opportunity maybe to understand more so the changes that need to take place and just some of the damage that has happened.
Awesome. Thank you for being here, Jackie. Yeah, and I think I really appreciate what was shared by all of our panelists as you did your introductions. I think our hope and our heart is that people will listen and consider, and that, there's collective wisdom here right now in this conversation. There's people that are specialists that they give attention to these issues every day. And I think that's where, those that are being faced with the helping professionals that are being come to for help, don't always face these issues every day. And so knowing that there's a resource of people that really have taken that deeper dive, have done the deeper training, it's so important to get to specialized help. The church is not immune to issues of problematic sexual behavior or broken marriages or sexual misconduct. And, even those that know God and love Jesus or any religion, that has helped them bring them to a point of being spiritual doesn't mean that they're superhuman and immune to these things. And so that's part of what we're acknowledging. We're acknowledging a lot of truth. We're trying to take a hard, honest look at things and just be like, this is the way it is. And the patriarchy is real. It does exist. It has had a major effect on people, like we said, men and women, and that not everyone has really paused to consider that it is still in effect and that it is having an effect and it does exist. And we need to do better. And that's something at SASH we're passionate about, is like, we want to make a difference. Everyone deserves a healthy relationship. Everyone deserves sexual health. And so we want these things for the world, and we're here to try to make a difference. So with that being said, I think I want to start this conversation, and Brian is going to co-facilitate with me. We're going to bring some questions forward and then hear from our panelists. But one of the first questions is, help people hear and see what's going on and feel even some of the outrage. Like if this hasn't hit their life, if they're unaware, what makes a difference? Maybe you speak from personal experience. What made a difference for you? What made you see it? What made you hear it? How do we help other people? So I'm going to open that up for your thoughts and feedback.
I can jump in. I think one really positive thing about the role that I have as a pastor is that we do have a weekly platform to be able to tell stories and highlight things like that. And so I think for us, what we're always trying to do is to highlight people's stories, specifically in this area, women's stories of their engagement with the patriarchy, and bringing in, I think it's a mixture, right? We try to bring in really qualified, experts, but to talk about these things. But we also just have, women in our church who get up and share their stories, right? They might not, have certifications or be experts in treatment or things like that, but they're experts in their experience with the patriarchy, and that's a really beautiful thing to be able to highlight and share. And so we're trying to constantly do that, whether that's through panel discussions or bringing in speakers or things like that. And then putting that on all of our, like social and online channels to try to get it out as much as possible. So I think the biggest success we've had is sharing those stories, bringing in expert teachers to be able to raise awareness about this really significant issue.
If I can piggyback onto Zach, he is exactly, he had the same exact direction that I was going to go with stories. It was when I posted a woman's story of spiritual abuse, emotional abuse in her own home with her husband, that I connected with her story. And she was labeling it as spiritually abusive, emotionally abusive. It's like, wait a minute, if she's calling it that, why am I not calling my experience that? And it caused me to reflect and look at my own experience and see, why am I not calling it that? But is there validity to that? Personal stories I have found to be the most effective way and means of reaching people, because you can give them dry information, statistics, whatever. It's not meaningful until you can personally connect with that experience. And so as somebody is sharing their story, it's very emotionally compelling, and it draws people to listen, to engage, to reflect on what that experience might be like. And that is, to me, the best way to facilitate change, because like I said, reading dry information just doesn't penetrate. You have to come alongside somebody, have empathy, and gain understanding of what that was like for that person. So yeah, I absolutely echo Zach's idea on stories.
There's a definite power in stories, and you can't really dismiss someone's personal experience when they're telling you this is what happened. And like you were saying too, it's the person who's experiencing it also is on this journey for trying to find a language to attach to their experience. And once they find it, it's, that helps them speak their truth. They're like, no, this is it. I found the word that makes sense of what I've been through. And that's what I've appreciated on my journey so much about these professional communities, the specialists that in all these different areas of addiction and trauma and abuse, and that help us know, when something's off, what's going on. And that's what's helpful. I think in the faith communities, we have a language there, but sometimes it's a limited language, and it can be narrowed down to like looking at things just through a lens of like sin or something where you're like, you're missing, there's more there. That's not the only lens to look through. That's not the only language to understand something in. So being open-minded, I think that's a call to action here on this call, is like being open-minded to get into other communities, learn other languages, open that up. What else comes to mind that helps others hear and understand?
I'd like to kind of follow up with what you just said. It's kind of, I guess what draws me into this is, just, and I'll get biblical here. We're created in the image and likeness of God, and there's a human dignity about us. So I think it's, I always like kind of struggle with people outside the faith. How do you bring them in? Or, like kind of people don't have any understanding of things. And, your question was like for men in particular, like, so how do you kind of bring that conversation? Because a lot of the blogs are kind of limited to the people who've been impacted, but not other people outside. And I guess the parallel I use with, and this is kind of with compulsive sexual disorder, I did a lot of work in addictions. Most of my career is in transportation and the world of work. It's huge. But when I came across sex addiction, at the time, I was blown away by it. And I kind of said to myself, I need to get this out to other people. And I certainly presented like at professional conferences, but how do I introduce this topic in regular conversations? Because that's how we meet people. We meet people in our own lives. I was talking to a brother deacon last night. I said, I'm going to be part of this panel. I don't know how it's going to go. But I think, it's important, and I'll have conversations with other people. And I think that's kind of a good way to kind of make those connections, and certainly hearing, and this is why I'm really excited about being here, is because hearing the stories. And I listened to the panel discussion over the holiday weekend, and that was very intimidating. I felt very bad for the people impacted, but I thought, well, this is something I need to learn more and more about. And as we share our stories, but it's kind of how we leverage our relationships with other people, and other opportunities that come our way, and to be knowledgeable of it. And also, kind of be ready for pushback or disagreement, which is all part of it. And I think that's an important part, actually, quite frankly, and engage in that type of discussion as well. But I'm always one who looks for the commonalities. Where can I build a bridge? That's always my mantra with everyone I meet. It's not where we're different, it's where I can build a bridge. And I think that's a kind of a helpful response.
I said in our last discussion that I think I might have said it early on, but I was saying that, as a CSAT and as somebody who works with many males and females who struggle with sex addiction, compulsive sexual behaviors, I think it's important that they have female voices as part of their healing journey. And it's been interesting, as I've kind of worked with my male clients, and sometimes they have asked me questions like, as a woman, like, or I've had them say to me, like, I have to think of you as not being a woman so that I'm not inappropriate with you. And I'm kind of like, well, what do you think I am? Like, I am a woman, like, and let's have that conversation about why you can't see me as a woman and show up to my office and be appropriate. Like, let's have that conversation, and it usually goes well. And we end up having, I think, a better relationship, therapeutic relationship moving forward, right? Where they will ask me other questions that they are struggling with or that they don't understand from that female perspective. And so I think it's important, that we are able to talk about, especially as a female, that I can talk about being impacted by patriarchy or how I view things or my lived experience in a way that isn't, shaming or judgmental, but also, that I can be knowledgeable about that. I can have some pretty impassioned viewpoints while also making space for the fact that maybe they haven't thought about certain things or they've never considered a concept or an idea, and that they maybe want to, but they have a lot of questions about that. And so I think having safe spaces for maybe some of that learning and the unfolding process to happen is also really important as we have the conversation and as we come across the opportunities to do that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jackie. And there's so much focus on gender, sometimes an over focus on in some faith communities, and this differentiation, whereas it's like, what is it like to be human? Like, to me, on that, we're two humans. We can talk about things. We can acknowledge things. We don't have to over sexualize anything. Like, we can treat, I think that's part of what would help in faith communities is just being a little more normal about these things. When we talk about sex positive, even just the creation of it, and that we're all sexual beings. This is, we don't have to be weird about this. We don't have to be hidden about this. Like, that's part of what creates some of the problems. And then, this is about shifting power back to where there's a mutuality, mutual respect, mutual value, and not one gender being elevated over another. So yeah, appreciate that. Well, I'm going to pass the baton to Brian, my co-facilitator, and tell us first, Brian, more about what you do, who you are, and then we'll continue the conversation.
Well, as I mentioned a few moments ago, I am a CSAT and I'm in private practice in Fredericksburg, Virginia. I work with both addicts and partners. I've learned a tremendous amount from working with partners, and I'm grateful to have an APSAT trained certified coach with me. On that lifetime, I'm also in recovery, gratefully recovering sex and love addict. But so just one thing about the previous question, how it's touched me, not right in my face, but pretty darn close. Again, I am a member of the Episcopal Church in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and they've nominated 4 people to be the new bishop. And incredibly, it was all 4 white men. And needless to say, it was caught many, many people's attention. However, one of the persons on the nominating committee, who's a member of my local faith community, African-American woman, said, well, there weren't any either women or African-American men who came forward to be nominated. So that's a reality. But then she went on to say, which I think is more relevant, is that in the Diocese of Virginia, in the Episcopal Church, which encompasses a good portion of the state, there's only one African-American male who's rector, that means the head pastor of the parish, and then very few women who are rectors. And her comment was, we have much work to do. The person who was chosen, I think, is going to do a really, really great job, but that's just the call, and then it just provides me with more motivation in this particular time in my life when I am recognizing and speaking out more about the impact of the patriarchy in general, but particularly in the church, or as my wife put it, who was raised in an evangelical church and is now an Episcopalian like me, she said, it's still Virginia. So, but anyway, those of you or have any connection with the South might get that a little bit more. But anyway, our next question is, what is the responsibility of faith leaders to act on the problem? So Gina and I welcome anyone who'd like to share about that. Again, what's the responsibility of faith leaders to act on this problem, the patriarchy, and how it hurts women?
I'll jump in. I come from the evangelical background, and frankly, they don't think there's a problem. They think that those who think patriarchy is a problem, those are the problems right there. So at the very beginning, we have a doctrinal issue where so many of the church leaders, look at the Southern Baptists and others, believe that men should be in charge of women, and there is no equality there. So to go against that is really climbing an uphill battle. And when we have church leaders who freely, unashamedly tell Beth Moore, go home, we've got a huge issue going on. So these church leaders are not going to get it until they change their doctrinal stance somehow. And so they don't want to get it either, because it also means relinquishing control. So this is a huge, huge problem in evangelical churches. And that's why I believe there are tens of thousands of women in harm's way in their marriages and in the churches, because those male leaders think that they are where they should be, and women have no business being church leaders. So the first step is to somehow, and I don't know what that looks like, engage those leaders and challenge them doctrinally so that they will, really take a look at the original languages.
I really appreciate you speaking that into this conversation, Julianne. I think you're spot on. One of my thoughts is, I don't think men that hold those doctrinal views will hear it from women. They're going to have to hear it from other men, which is why I also love that we're having these conversations together with men and women. But I'm curious, what do you think about that, Zach, Tom, Brian, Mike? Like, is that true? If so, how do men get involved in this? Pastor to pastor.
Yeah,
or clergy to clergy.
It's 100% true. I grew up evangelical as well. Gina graciously identified me as post-evangelical earlier, which is a title that I will gladly claim. But Julianne is exactly right. That is the predominant theology inside of evangelicalism. It is patriarchy dressed up in theology called complementarianism, and it's essentially a separate but equal doctrine between women and men. So they're equal before God, but separate in what they are allowed to do, which actually ends up meaning that they are unequal in the home, unequal in the church. And it's a huge problem. And I have I would say, I grew up Southern Baptist. My mind was changed in a college class. A male professor challenged me to look at women in scripture and engage with what they did, how they behaved, how Jesus treated them, the actual leadership roles that they held, and did a study of women in scripture and had my mind absolutely blown as a 19-year-old, and changed my belief system at that point to more of an egalitarian, or a completely egalitarian view of women and men's roles in the church and in the home. I would say, as someone who sees that as my main role inside of the kind of dismantling of the patriarchy, is trying to talk with other complementarian or patriarchal men about the theology behind it. It is it's slow going. It's an uphill battle. And there's this old, I believe it's a Native American proverb that says, you can't wake someone up who's pretending to be asleep. And I've come across that quite a bit, in that a lot of these men know the answers. They know that their theology doesn't actually hold up biblically when you look at the role of women in scripture. As Dr. Beth Allison Barr, who's phenomenal, wrote an incredible book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood. She always says biblical women do not hold up to the idea of what modern biblical womanhood is as subservient. When you look at biblical women, they totally knocked that out of the park. And they were leading and in all different kinds of amazing ways, even in a deeply patriarchal culture in the ancient Near East and in the first century Near East. So yeah, I would say that's an important thing that I see as my role, is trying to convince people. But I agree with Julianne, specifically toward the Southern Baptist Convention. Again, that is my background. They are battling with a report of, I believe it's currently 700 cases of abuse in the church, but it's going to be thousands and thousands and thousands when it's all said and done. And I think I struggle, because no matter how many reforms are made inside of a place like the Southern Baptist Convention, organizations that remain committed to patriarchy will never be safe for women. And I think we need to be very clear about that with people. And there is, as Mike said earlier, a lot of pushback when you try to talk about these things that way. But agree with everything that Gina and Julianne said. This is a huge problem. It is a baseline theological problem, a dogma, and it's a first order doctrine in a lot of these circles. Like, if you begin to question complementarianism or patriarchy, you are moved outside of what is considered orthodox, which is a real perversion of the term orthodox in general, but that's how it's used to kind of silence dissenters. And so we've been kicked out of denominations, church networks, even an office space that was held in another church for our views around women and other kind of equality and inclusion initiatives that we have at our church. So it does come with a lot of pushback, but I believe that it's the right thing to do. And like I said, I think that is my main role inside of all of this, platforming women as much as possible to share their stories, and then pushing back against patriarchal theology inside of church circles, specifically with male clergy.
Good. Getting practical. Share the stories. Push back on the dogma. What else?
I'll add one thing, like in my, maybe more of my personal conversations that I have with, males that are a part of my life, or that I'm in conversations with. Sometimes when I bring up issues around patriarchy, or when we're talking about that, I think a lot of them, I think that phrase, like not all men, hashtag not all men, they identify with that, or they don't see themselves as being part of the problem, right? And so they'll say, well, not all men. I mean, yeah, sure, this is wrong, and that extreme looks wrong, but like, I'm not that way. And I may say to them, like, okay, but do we have enough men? Like, if it's not all men, are there enough men speaking up? Are there enough men really disgruntled? Or is it more like, yeah, I think that's an issue. I may not say anything when I witness that happen, or I may not really push back against my, spiritual leaders or my religious leaders, but in private, I will support you, right? Which was a lot of my experience. Like, they might shoot me a text after I spoke up when I was, practicing in my faith. they might shoot me a text afterwards and say, hey, I appreciated what you said. But when push came to shove, I was the only person saying that. And I got a lot of heat from the leaders for not behaving the way they think that women should behave. So I would just question that, like, do we have enough men? Yeah, sure. I agree. It's not all men. I don't see my husband being one of those men who idly sits by, but we certainly need more, because it's not bringing about fully the changes that we need. And it's still, like Zach was saying, in his experience, it's still acceptable to, kick them out of their church home or their church office space if they have differing viewpoints.
Yeah, and I think so many men are so tied in to patriarchal world, the patriarchal world, especially in the Christian world, that they do hear any attack on the patriarchy as an attack on them, and that's a huge problem. And I think that we have to be able to, as Jackie said, push back against the kind of not all men dismissal, to say, well, it's not enough to, just kind of send a text every now and then. Like, it has to be you have to be able to speak out. You have to be clear. One of my favorite pastors talks about all the time when it comes to whether it's this or racial justice or things like that, that silence is violence. And that if you are committed to remaining quiet, especially in order to maintain relationships or power or anything like that, that you are just as much a part of the problem as the people actually committing the abuses.
Tom, I'm wondering what thoughts you might have now. It looks like you've just opened your mic, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I really agree with what Zach and Jackie have shared. This is such a complex problem, and there's such great diversity in the church. Just a couple of thoughts that I have are, those of us in the CSAT community know Adrian Hickman down at Capstone Treatment in Searcy, Arkansas. And Adrian loves to say, ask the question, what makes this make sense? And when you see these intractable voices and leaders that are pontificating in such a way that you know that they're harming others, they're impossible to reach, they're kicking you out of office spaces, doing some of these things to exclude voices that are asking pertinent and relevant and important and pastorally significant questions. What makes that make sense? And to me, there's multiple motivations. And Julie, I think, Julie, you mentioned control. Control for sure is a piece of that. But what fuels the control oftentimes is a very hidden, submerged combination of fear and shame. So there's the fear of losing power, losing place, the fear of the criticism, the fear of losing the hold on the congregation. The way we've structured congregational ministry, and especially on the North American continent, is complex and pretty counter-biblical. And I realize that if any of my evangelical colleagues were watching this or would watch in the future, they just disconnected from what I have to say. But it isn't, however we want to say, of a good biblical model. It's a business model. It's an American individualistic model. There are dynamics in leading congregations. I mean, Zach, I just got to salute you, because I was a church planter. I was a pastor for years. It is really hard work, and the voices that can come at you sideways, or the voices in your own head that are concerned about this group of people or what those folks are thinking, or raising the budget one more time, or paying off the second expansion of the building project. What pastors face, there's no excuse, there's no whining in pastoral ministry, but what they face are multiple dynamics, and then they have their interior issues of shame and their interior issues of fear, and it results in ways to try and control and maintain the status quo. And when we try and address something as serious and as detrimental to spiritual vitality as patriarchy, we're always going to have huge pushback, because we're trying to change a system that's fighting to stay alive even while it's going down. The church is losing the position that it thinks it used to have in our culture. Now, there's a part of me at my age is looking at that going, well, this is John 15. I mean, Jesus is pruning his church, and some of that needs to happen. Most of what we're going to be able to do in terms of helping spiritual leaders confront patriarchy in their own souls, in their own behaviors, and then in the patterns that they're replicating or supporting or tolerating in their congregations. And I agree, silence is violence. I totally agree. It's going to be one-on-one relationally done, because they have to be in conversations where they feel safe and they can learn to be vulnerable and they can approach their shame. And when we fire salvos at each other across social media or different ways, we're seeing that in our whole culture. We've got a culture that's living out of its limbic system, just shouting at each other and defending itself and getting angrier and pushing the fear button, and everybody's an other and an or. But I'm wandering. Back to the main thing, what I'm concerned about, what we're concerned about, is what's happening to women, how they're being victimized, how they've always been victimized, always been utilized for supporting, being the backbone of the church, making the church happen, making the church function, raising the next generation of the church, taking them for granted, and then absolutely dismissing the ways in which they've been used and abused egregiously, not just in sexual practices, but in so many emotional practices. Is not okay. It is a piece of what took Jesus to the cross, because Jesus pushed boundaries in how he interacted with women years and years and years ago. I mean, I had the privilege of going to Fuller Seminary, attending there, and I did both of my degrees from Fuller, but I also went to Princeton Seminary. So I'm a recovering Presbyterian there. That's out now. But at Fuller, I had a systematic theology professor, Paul Jewett. He's gone on to the next life now, but he wrote a book, Man is Male and Female. And did he get hammered in the evangelical / fundamentalist, back when there was a difference between evangelicalism and fundamentalism community, for suggesting that even the Apostle Paul, as he was hammering out his theology of the gospel of Jesus while he was on the mission field of planting churches in his apostolic work, that the Apostle Paul was sorting out the role of male and female and how it all fits together, and was in transition from one Jewish model which he'd inherited, which was the hierarchy model, to that statement in Galatians of, in Christ, there's neither male nor female. And there's always going to be a blowback when we're trying to push the question of, what is the Lord really saying? What is Jesus really saying? What is our Creator really saying in creating us in these gender modes and setting us in motion in relationship with each other? And it's hard for people to see femininity in the Godhead, but it's there, and it's there in the Old Testament scriptures. And it's, if you look for it, it's there and it's quite clear. So it's going to take a lot of work, but in the meantime, we've really got to pay attention to, and these are some of the questions we're going to address here, talk about here, and kick around, is while we're waiting for leadership to hopefully come around, and that's going to be a one-on-one process, we have to do grassroots work that's really competent and really individually focused, and helping women that are being abused, that are being hurt, that are being ostracized, that are being victimized, and are being kept in places where they're just not allowed to grow into the personhood and experience the personhood that our Creator meant for them to have. Just some of my thoughts.
I so appreciate what you're sharing. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think let's talk more about this practical, tangible action. And what does it even look like to grow a grassroots movement? I mean, we're talking about one-on-one, but yet we also know in grassroots movements, you have to rally people, that there's power in numbers, and creating a movement of types. Like when you were talking about at the core of control being fear and shame, I'm like, who do we get to help with that? Brene Brown. Like, how do we get to the core of shame. I'm like, how do we rally someone like that? How do we get into the conferences where clergy and pastors and faith leaders are gathering and, do a proposal for a presentation on this everywhere we can, or have a hashtag, silence is violence, that goes viral, that a group of people start to use, or I don't know. These are just what I'm spitballing as I'm listening to this conversation, but how do we get practical and tangible to make a difference? Because I feel like one-on-one, there's that empathy and sympathy for the problem, but like it takes a movement to change a culture. We see that in other ways. And yeah, Martin Luther King, right? Just an example of someone that was on a mission, had a vision, had a dream, and then rallied. But what are the thoughts on practical, tangible efforts to systematically confront and change patriarchy?
I wanted to jump on after Tom was talking about that personal connection with people. And one of the things that I've seen, so Wayne Grudem, who worked with John Piper on and created the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, he still believes in a hierarchy, but there was one, and in patriarchy, they could call it complementarian, but I still believe it's patriarchy. One really interesting thing happened. So one common thought in evangelical churches for divorce, it's two-pronged. You could either, if your spouse abandons you or you have an affair, someone has an affair, then they'll agree that you can get divorced. What's not included is domestic violence, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, those things. So a lot of churches will force a woman. I mean, they'll say, no, you can't get divorced because it's not biblical. They don't have a full understanding of the concept of divorce in the Bible and the historical background. But what's interesting is that Wayne Grudem had, I can't remember who it was, somebody in his family who was in domestic violence. And through that experience, it caused him to reevaluate what he had been taught in scripture about divorce. And it just didn't make sense for him that this victim of domestic violence should have to be forced to remain with that abusive spouse. And so he came out publicly on record and say, I have changed my viewpoint. I have changed my way of thinking. I absolutely believe that women who are in harm's way have a biblical right to get divorced. So again, it's that personal connection that caused him to really reevaluate. Is he still complementarian? Yes. However, that was one victory on that road to getting help for women. So I think we need to think little baby steps and really rejoice about every little victory that comes along the way. My own pastor told me I didn't have permission to get divorced. And then 3 years later, last summer, he was apologizing to me and my 7 children in this living room right here, saying I was wrong. So those, again, the personal relationship. So I think it's really important to start there. And then hopefully those folks will start speaking out and encouraging others.
Mike, please go ahead.
Sure. That's a lot there. Well, I guess to Julie's point, I think it's, it's by personal experience, and having, and it shouldn't come to that, but it does oftentimes, right? But it's funny, and this may totally miss everybody here, but I used to live in Queens, New York, in Astoria, Queens, and I would fly into LaGuardia Airport. And I would get a cab. And when I told the cab I went to, 2535 33rd Street, they'd look at me and they'd be very, very angry. And the reason why they were angry was this fare wasn't going into Manhattan. It was only about 2 miles away. And they were annoyed at me. And I was like, what can I do? Can I move? And I share that as an analogy. You know, a lot of men are in positions in their churches of power, and not that they, and it, you know, and I think we have to be careful of the intent. And I'm hearing, you know, some like control issues and things like that. And maybe that's kind of systemic in some of the, you know, the Protestant. Catholicism is a lot different. We just assign people, they go, you know, that's kind of, you don't pick a parish, you know, you're assigned a parish. It's not equal, it's not like democratic like North American is TC. It's very European actually. But my point is that we have to be careful of our emotion attached to it. Like the cab driver, you know, like, dude, I can't do anything different. I'm not going to move, but I'm sorry for it. But actually, there was a solution. And what they did was cab drivers got together and they said, well, if we get a local fare, we can go to the front of the line when we come back. So that's a workaround of sorts. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that there are people in leadership who are open to listening to things. They may not have the passion that everyone in this room does, and they may have multiple issues that they're dealing with. And you know, it's so looking for those opportunities. And then I think the other thing that we haven't really talked about, we kind of mentioned this biblically, but the women in all the congregations that have contributed and have grown the church and the work that they do, there needs to be a way of kind of bringing that forward more and more and more, and why that's of value. I read an article in American Magazine, which is a Jesuit publication, and it talked about motherhood and how it gets short-shifted. We don't talk about it. And it was written by a woman who, you know, had problems, but not recognizing the value of it. She actually compared it to like military people, which was kind of an interesting contrast. But we need to kind of assert the things that people do well in any church, quite frankly. And for me personally, my church leaders, I mean, I value them, the priest and, you know, whoever. But for me, it's word and sacrament. I'm there for the word. I'm there for the sacrament. That's what brings me closer to Christ. That's what motivates me. Person administering that, I hope that they can kind of assert it more, but it goes a little deeper for me, you know, just in that regard. But there are opportunities for us. And finally, one thing, and this is just another story, but it kind of talks about where we're at. We're really out in the margins quite a bit now, you know, just in terms of, and a number of years ago, I took my daughter to the Constitution Center here in Philadelphia. And Bill Bradley wrote a book that was about American politics. And this kind of is pre-internet, so to speak. And he could see the polarization. And he said, that's going to be a problem because it's going to be more and more extremes. We have to work from the middle. We have to work into the middle. That's my thought, you know. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And it's these opportunities right here are really good, you know, just in that regard. So.
A related question sent to us on the chat was, what doctrines do any of us feel need to be changed?
Oh, we can't hear you, Tom. But yeah, that someone's wanting a practical example of a doctrine, if it could be changed to make a difference.
Yeah, I think I saw that question. I think that's the direction in which lay dragons. So I think if we wander into that one, we'll never be heard from again. So I would respectfully say, can we return to some of the basics that we find common in the faith and remind both our leaders and then those that make up all the multiple tiers of leadership and congregations of those basic rubrics? And so instead of getting into systematic theology or doctrines, come back to the broad brushstrokes of what's painted for us in the Old and New Testament. I'll get to a specific picture, and that's shepherding. That's the whole idea of caring for the sheep. That's a beautiful biblical motif, and it gets abused in lots of different ways. But in Ezekiel's prophecy, 34th chapter of Ezekiel in the Old Testament, and then in John's gospel, where Jesus is talking in the 10th chapter about I'm the door, I'm the great shepherd, etc., I'm the good shepherd. In both of those passages, there's this whole idea of the protection of the sheep, the feeding, the nurturing of the flock, and the whole idea of there's good shepherding that's gone on, there's bad shepherding that's gone on. And if we can bring our conversations back around to and picking up on what Julie was talking about in terms of stories, that Wayne Grudem story is a powerful story, and it's a powerful example at the same time. It's both. We need to collect these kinds of stories where people have looked into the lives of others and seen the suffering and moved in response. And Wayne adjusted his theological paradigm somewhat because he saw the suffering of someone who was important to him, and it made sense, or what they were asked to endure under a particular theological rubric didn't make any sense when he saw their suffering. And we need to appeal really to the best nature that really does still reside within each one of us, the best heart. It's when we're shouting at each other, or when we're labeling, or when we're pushing at the front door, that sometimes we're just always going to meet with the resistance institutionally as well as individually. But when we appeal to heart, and when we appeal to the broader theological pieces that are practical as well, like taking care of those who are disenfranchised or undernourished or being abused or being hurt, and seeing them as valid co-inheritors of the grace of God and life on this little planet, then we begin to intuitively adjust our theology like Wayne did. If we approach it front on, well, here's the doctrines that need to be changed, then the defenses are mounted, the arguments and we write papers, or we throw tweets at each other, and somebody's still getting beat up tonight, somebody's still being deprived tonight, somebody's still being yelled at tonight, somebody's still being manipulated and gaslighted tonight. It doesn't change anything.
I would add one thing, because I don't think we want, right, to go back, just adding to what TC said, we don't want to go back to or we don't want to move forward into more benevolent patriarchy, which still maybe, takes care of women, or recognizing that abuse of women isn't okay, but still says males still know what's best, and males still are the ones with the authority. So we don't want to, go back or forward or wherever we want to more of a benevolent patriarchy. But I think too, we have to be asking ourselves the questions. And I don't want to get into doctrine either, but I think we need to be asking the questions of like, what is missing, right? There are parts that, there were like scriptural pages that were written that were maybe intentionally, thoughtfully left out of the Bible. Why? What do those say? I think we also could look at like, when patriarchy was becoming into being and becoming the structure system, what beliefs or what teachings were there previous to patriarchy coming into existence, and that got left behind or were intentionally shifted or left out? Why, there were things that were left out. There were ways of living and being that changed. And I think sometimes asking maybe not what doctrine needs to change here, but what was changed and what has been left behind and why.
Well, I'll jump in and say, Jackie, I totally agree with you. I do think that's very important. And I think those conversations around what's been left out, or have we really taken, do we have a summary view of church history and church development that's not complete? Yes, absolutely. Did women have a much more dominant role or participative role, egalitarian role in the emerging Christian movement under Jesus and even under Paul? I mean, look at Paul and Lydia and the Church of Philippi. Come on. I mean, Paul utilized women wherever they were. He was able to use them because his whole idea was moving forward the gospel of Jesus. And yeah. And we don't want a gentler patriarchy. I hear what you're saying. It's in the use of the word patriarchy that some of our colleagues, and it's female as well as male colleagues, will react being attacked. And I don't want us to get into the wrong fight if we're really trying to advocate for a healthier sexuality, for a healthier, genuine regard of the, how do I want to say this, of the equivalent nature of the gender. That just seems so silly that you would even have to articulate that. And yet in Christianity, we do. I don't believe in a hierarchical system, and I grew up with it. I cut my teeth on it in some degrees in my formation, but it's not there biblically. It's not there functionally. It's not there from the creation narrative. So, Jackie, I do agree with you. We do need to go back. We need to have thoughtful conversations. We need to have better scholarship. And we need to blend that with what Julie's talking about in terms of cogent stories and then putting them together in competent books, in podcasts, and disseminating stories in packages where people are linking this to each other. So they're really thinking about things in ways that do confront their biases without confronting the wrong pieces where they can hide. They can hide behind some kind of a theological banner. I don't know. That's just some thought.
Well, circling it back to one of our basic questions, though, what is the challenge for us males regarding this? So my thought as a male is that more and more I'm doing this and called to, when I do see abuse happening, to say something. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think something really important to add to this is the idea of questioning a long-held belief system, or deconstructing or disentangling, or whatever you want to call it. It's an involuntary process that happens when something you've been taught and you believe conflicts with something you experience, right? And so for Wayne Grudem, he had been taught that you were supposed to stay in a marriage even if you were being abused, but then he experienced that on a very personal level where somebody he loved was being required to stay in a marriage even though they were being abused, and now he changes, right? And so I think that's where the theology and having great resources becomes really important, is when somebody experiences that clash, where do they go to find some kind of resources? So I put Marg's resources in the chat. I think she's one of the very best. I recommended a bunch of stuff on our last one too. But I think that's where the resources become important. But on a much more practical level, something that we're trying to do is not just have kind of the personal or local safe place for women to have these conversations to get out of abusive relationships at our church. That is a huge value that we have. I could talk more about that later, but on the larger practical scale, I believe, Tom, you were mentioning earlier about how essentially money is used by fundamentalists and evangelicals to control theological perspectives, to silence dissenters and things like that, right? And so the biggest area that I have personal experience with this is in church planting, starting new churches. So if you are not a specific kind of a pastor planting a specific kind of a church, hear that as male pastor planting a complementarian church, you very rarely can get money to plant a church unless you go mainline. And a lot of the more kind of progressive mainline churches really struggle with church planting, of kind of knowing how to do it. And so the evangelicals are the best at it, but they hold the purse strings over you really, really tightly. We've lost 6 figures in funding over not being a complementarian church over the years, right? So this is very real cost. And thankfully we had other funding sources. We're able to get off the ground. We're a self-sustaining church that's helping start new churches now. But on the broader scale, something that we've been working on kind of behind the scenes, a female pastor that I'm close friends with, and then a male pastor on the West Coast. The 3 of us met at a post-evangelical gathering last October. And for the last 7 or 8 months, we've been trying to put together and build what essentially would be a church planting organization that would support people who could not get funding from traditional evangelical sources, specifically women, right? So how could we plant female-led churches all over the country in strategic cities? And how do we fund this? Talking to business people, talking to other church leaders, connecting with the churches who were at the gathering. We thought there were going to be like 30 churches represented at this gathering back in last October, and there were 120. And so how do we harness that momentum to say, okay, if you're not a specific kind of a pastor planting a specific kind of a church, you can't get money. Let's make that what used to be the case. How do we fund these different church models, and specifically female-led churches? And so that's something that it's very much in the works and is not quite ready yet. But the hope is that by fall or early 2023, we'll be able to start bringing in and doing kind of holistic church planting, from recruiting to evaluating to training, and then launching and sustaining financially church plants that are led by women and other people who can't get funding from more of the fundamentalists that hold all of the money. So in a practical way, that's something that I've got a real passion for, is starting more churches where they can be safe spaces for women. And a lot of times that's because they're point led by women.
That is exciting news, Zach. That is some trailblazing right there. And I can only imagine the impact. I know for me, I've been able to attend your church here in Austin, and it has done a lot for me to see women in the role of pastor and acknowledged as a pastor alongside male pastors. There's a lot of diversity in your church. There's people that have been divorced that are on staff. They're not excluded from anything. You know, I'm like, it's really been refreshing. And I think that's the thing, is that, yeah, seeing it, experiencing it goes a long way, and creating places for people with church hurt, like we talk about, that want to be in church, but can't stand some of the dysfunction or issues like this that haven't been appropriately acknowledged. So that's awesome. Let's keep talking about practical ways that we empower women. Like, how do we help them get access, if something is access to help and support, let me say, if they are not getting the appropriate support and value that they need? What are the resources out there for empowering women? As well as just any more thoughts on, you know, practical, tangible things we can do to confront the patriarchy.
Well, I've got a network of resources for women who are in harmful marriages or thinking about leaving their spouse, or just needing some support. Leslie Vernick probably was a trailblazer as far as identifying emotional abuse as a legitimate abuse, so that women could get divorced. Natalie Hoffman is another author, and she has private groups. She wrote the book, oh, hang on a second. Is it me? And her book really touched me and helped me to identify what I was experiencing. There is a book called Life-Saving Divorce by Gretchen Baskerville. Phenomenal book. It's talking about women who are needing help. They may be experiencing chronic medical issues, physical issues, because they've been living in chronic emotional abusive relationships. So she gives so much information in that book. That's Gretchen Baskerville, Life-Saving Divorce. Anybody can reach out to me, and I think our information will be posted at the end. And I can, I kind of look at myself like what is it called? A first responder type of thing. And I refer people, but I'm on Twitter as Defend the Sheep, and I can quickly refer people there as well. So I have a private group with over 100 women. That's free. There are other paid groups as well. So there really is an exploding number of groups for women who are in harm's way. And that's very, very exciting. And it's also very exciting that women are saying enough is enough, and they're getting out of those harmful relationships. And even if they're not getting support from their church, you can get support from other women who have already gone this journey. And that's the beautiful thing, is a lot of women are staying in these groups years after their divorce, just because they know what it was like and they want to help. So that's pretty cool.
I was going to say, and piggybacking on what Julie said, I think, there's some great resources for women in that crisis moment when they're looking at getting out of an unsafe situation. And unfortunately, we rely on women who have this personal experience to kind of do the heavy lifting long term. I don't know that there's enough long-term resources to actually bring about empowerment. As a mental health advocate, I'm one person who always says, like, when the conversation shifts and says, well, that's a mental health issue, I'm like, great, let's have that conversation. Oh, no, there's not actually a conversation we're having. It's just we're pointing and saying that's a mental health issue, end of it, right? Instead of addressing like how difficult it can be to access mental health treatment on a long-term basis, which in most cases is what's needed, right? In order to really shift from this place of being a victim into a place of personal empowerment, that takes time. And I don't find that as a country, we're real patient with that. We want like immediate results. We want it to happen yesterday or last year. And we need to like have the conversation that says these things take time. They're small steps. Yes, it can happen. And it works if everybody does their own work, right? And goes through a similar process of looking at themselves and understanding their biases, understanding maybe beliefs that they were given that are not working. Then I think we have more patience and we understand, oh, it's a journey. It takes time. We can't expect, change in a month or in 3 months or in 12 sessions. But that's a conversation that often is missing. And I think, there's several of us mental health professionals. I think we need to be having that conversation in more of our conversations in the real world, just saying this takes time. We can't expect change to happen quickly, not permanent change, not long-lasting change.
If I may step in and for my colleague here, Jackie Pack, Jackie, what I hear you saying is referencing much of what you said in your most recent podcast on a related gun violence and grievance stories. I think I encourage any of us to check that out. I'll put that up, and insofar as how the mental health field, but it's like a very poignant point you made, Jackie, is it's violence against women, but it's men's violence against women, as you pointed out there. So again, that's the how we need to keep speaking out about that.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question for the group. What's a good faith leader? We talked about funding, and I don't have the answer. I think that's something I'm struggling with myself. But what's a good faith leader, and how do we know that someone's good? And because I think part of this is an issue of power, and I don't think it's necessarily an issue around male or female. I've had limited experience, but one client that was early on in my practice was a female pastor of a prominent Protestant church, and all the players were female. The bishops were, unlike what Brian had described in his diocese there. So what makes a good faith leader, I think, is a good question as well, because I think it ties into kind of what we're talking about as well, in terms of, being just and recognizing everyone's dignity and being supportive that way. So that's my thought.
Well, and I think, what comes to my mind, Mike, is just the value on people and keeping a balance of power, like you said, no matter what the gender is, but just like I worked at the National Domestic Violence Hotline. It happens to be headquartered here in Austin. And their mission statement is shifting power back to, like, it's such a beautiful phrase about, to those that need support that have been in unhealthy or abusive relationships. I obviously forget exactly how the mission statement was stated at this point. I used to have it memorized, but yeah, that acknowledgement that like at the core of abuse is power and control issues always, and that it's really this shift and this equality and valuing no matter, like I said, who the genders are. So yeah, I think we're talking about like we're really advocating for health and healthy churches, healthy faith communities, that's kind of the overarching thing. We have to address this issue of patriarchy because that is at play and why sometimes there isn't health. But at the end of the day, I mean, that's what we want, are healthy, authentic, real, vibrant communities, faith communities where there is, everyone is experiencing the image of God and somehow that is being conveyed despite the gender. So yeah, I appreciate that thought for sure, because it really is, what makes for a healthy place, and how do we're looking at the how to, how do we move the needle, and how do we do that as professionals in our work individually and collectively. So, I mean, I love so much of what's being said today. You said, Mike, earlier about acknowledging the work of women. I thought that was so beautiful of like, what if communities did that more in faith communities, just acknowledging what's happened with women, what they're doing, sharing those stories, sharing one-on-one with other leaders, your thoughts about dogma or the shifts that happen for you. I mean, that's something practical I think anyone can do of even, and if this conversation, if any of our conversations put up by SASH ignite new thoughts or change, bring that into conversations with friends, with others, and getting to influencers and leaders is important. And I think that's where there's the strategy involved in this too, of like, how do we take this in a more proactive way into conversations, to shift some of the dogma, but also to advocate for the protection of women. So I think we're coming up on our time for this conversation, but any last thoughts on that? And I know Zach has a resource, something he's done practically in his church, that I wanted you to share. But like, any last thoughts, I would love to hear from each panelist. I'm actually going to go around of just tell us, anything you would personally like to see come from this. Go ahead, Zach. We'll start with you.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, I think just in the level of, in the vein of kind of practicality inside of all this, especially if you're a faith leader watching, something that we've tried to do that is really simple and practical is that to create a safe space, not only where abuse doesn't happen, obviously that is 100% the goal, but realizing that when you have a group of people, specifically as it gets larger and larger, there are more opportunities for abusive things to happen. And so not only a safe space where hopefully it doesn't happen, but if it does, making sure that there is a reporting structure that is appropriate and above board and all of that kind of stuff, because that's where so many things happen, as Julianne said earlier, when somebody goes to a pastor with an issue and it's either swept under the rug or it's pushed aside or it's just not properly dealt with. Even as Mike said, even if people have the best hearts ever, if they don't have any training on how to deal with this, if they don't have any expertise, specifically around divorce, I will say that working in churches since I was 19, getting degrees from seminaries and things like that, we were always taught that the goal is to stay together. Like beyond anything else doesn't matter. I grew up Southern Baptist, like I said, and the little mantra was, well, you can kill him, but you can't divorce him. And so that was like always what was said, right? And so knowing that for most pastors, that's all the training that we get. So how do we take real practical steps? Well, what we've done is partnered with an organization called Ethics Suite. They're one of the preeminent kind of reporting structure organizations. They work with mostly businesses. They actually told us that we were not their first nonprofit client, but their first church client in the country. And what we've done is hired them. And so we've let all of our folks know that you can go to ethicsuite.com/restoreaustin and you can file a complaint, a grievance. You can report abuse or misconduct or anything like that. You can choose to do it anonymously. You can choose all these different things, whether you want to be contacted or not. And then you get a case number, and basically we're able then to follow up Now, what's really cool about it is once it's reported, it cannot be deleted. Like nobody can ever delete it. And it is inside of the structure of Ethics Suite. The way that we have it is that the report goes to Ethics Suite first, and our contact person there. And if it's not about somebody on the board, then it goes to the board as a group, which has women and men on it, to be able to deal with that together. If it is about somebody on the board, then it goes through Ethics Suite and a third party general counsel that we have, so that it's not, you know, given to a board member about a board member, and then they're able to influence the way that the conduct or the case is dealt with. And so it really is able to kind of put power back into the hands of somebody who's been abused or victimized in some way. And our goal really is to tell as many people about that as possible, so that churches are able to partner with organizations like Ethics Suite and be able to deal with these things really effectively. So that's a real practical thing that we've done that I think churches everywhere should do. You should have third-party organizations as a part of this who do this professionally, who are so much better at it than we are, because, you know, that's what Jesus would do, right? I mean, he would keep things above board. He would care for people who've been hurt and marginalized, and he would let nothing get in his way to making that happen.
Awesome, Zach. Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed when there's something that hits the news about a scandal in a faith community. Oftentimes there wasn't the proper investigation. And it's like, this is such a practical way to hire someone that knows what they're doing, a reporting structure, and bring that in to faith communities. Love it. Okay, any last thoughts, Mike?
Sure, just really quick. This is for faith leaders. You know, Christ humbled himself to share in our humanity. And it is from a place of humility that any change will really take place. And that doesn't mean that doesn't diminish your skills or anything like that. But I think humility opens us up to others. And I think that would be my message to faith leaders.
Awesome. Thank you. Tom.
Yeah, I think Mike said that super well. I just encourage ministry leaders of any level, any size, to come back to the basics, particularly in a Christian framework of Jesus' words. So the 2 commandments that stand out: love your creator with every part of yourself and love one another. And Jesus saying that again last night before his suffering: I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. His introductory salvo in Luke 4 of quoting Isaiah's scroll and talking about the Spirit of the Lord is on him to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim God's favor, the season, the era of God's favor. That's our foundation in ministry. But then look at how he behaved and the egalitarian approach he had with women. A lot of people don't pay attention to that verse in the Gospels that tells us that it was women who actually paid for the ministry of Jesus. So our sisters have been paying from the beginning in one way or another, and it's time that we bring everything into the light. The other piece that I would really strongly encourage the spiritual leaders is to get training, to get information, to get equipped. You can't be an expert in this area, but you can be informed. And it's really important to get legitimate and solid information. Again, I mentioned this before, but I think the pastoral sex addiction professional certification through ITAP is really a great tool to give ministry leaders who sex addiction isn't going to be their thing, or becoming therapists isn't their thing, but they can be equipped with so many of the dynamics that afflict the spiritual vitality of spiritual communities. I think that's just priceless training. And I wish every church in America would send somebody for the PSAP training. And with that, I'll pass. Thanks.
I'm going to elevate that message because I'm glad you brought that up. The getting additional training is so important. In fact, SASH too offers certifications and is developing more. So you don't have to be a therapist. And like we mentioned, like you can go to seminary and not receive any mental health training, addiction training, abuse, relationship and sexual issues. And so like going for that advanced education outside the church enhances your role as a faith leader for sure. So thank you for sharing that. Julianne.
I was just going to say, I think it's really important to, those of us who have knowledge and resources to facilitate opportunities with church leaders and provide information for them. Also, maybe even, if you have somebody who has a personal story, arrange a coffee date with the church leader and that person, just to say, I really want you to hear this person's story, because this story represents countless stories of others who could be sitting in your congregation. So again, it's inviting church leaders to connect with that story once again. And we are the ones who can do this.
Amen. All right, Jackie.
Yeah, one thing I would add, I think, training is important. As a mental health professional myself, who works with a lot of therapists as clients, unfortunately, training alone doesn't quite get us there. I think, I worked with a lot of therapists who have great training, but they have never done their own work. And it's creating problems for them as a therapist, right? I've worked with clients who their therapist crossed some pretty explicit professional boundaries and lost their license. And I'm working with the client who was betrayed by a professional therapist who had the training, right? So training alone, I don't know, is going to get us where we need to go. I think you have to do your work. You have to do that with a professional and make yourself accountable to a group of people who can call you out, who can, point out your blind spots or where they think you're going astray. Because I think, I think Tom and Zach have both mentioned, and Mike, it's not like women cannot be seduced by power and also become abusive. I think if we have that position where we're untouchable, that's a dangerous place to be. I would add one thing, just one resource, and I mentioned this last time, but I reread it since we met last time, and that is the book, The Creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner. There is so much in that book, gut-wrenching, heartbreaking, informative, that I think unless we understand how patriarchy came into being, I think it's going to be hard to dismantle it or really make effective change.
Well said. Well, I'm going to invite Brian to close us out. And I just want to thank you, Brian, for your leadership at SASH and your passion and expertise to enter into these kind of conversations, and for inviting me to be here too.
Gina, I share the same sentiment with you. I appreciate your leadership and sentiment and guidance and focus on all this. So all of you, thank you very much. We're about 5 minutes over, so we really appreciate your time. Invitation, please share this with as many folks as you can once it's ready for publication and distribution. Happy rest of the day. Blessings to all of you. We really appreciate you all being here. Take care. Okay.
And mute myself. So we had at one time 6 people watching live.
Okay.
Some comments that came in, and then the stuff that got put in the chat.
You're still live.